It helps us learn what we can from Afghanistan and apply it, not just to provide accountability and truth for the record, but for action in the future.
So,
I spent my life from 18 to 30 in the Army. I was fortunate to get to serve in the 75th Ranger Regiment, and one of the core missions that we trained on was non-combatant evacuation operations. In none of those training scenarios, I never did it live, we trained for it, but in Afghanistan, that was the mission. It was a non-combatant evacuation operation. In no training scenario that I'm aware of did we have a plan to ever take the military out first and then hope that somehow the civilians would get out. Have you ever heard of such a doctrine anywhere?
well, of course, I applaud you for your service. I have had the great honor of serving with our brave men and women in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they have inspired me, and I very much associate myself with what you said. I think the problem was, in my judgment, and I said it before, is that we planned for a single scenario, and that scenario was that the government and its troops would survive our withdrawal and for some time thereafter. And that's what informed, I think, the sequencing. That's my judgment.
So you believe that the State Department actually believed that they would trust the lives of American citizens to the Taliban? Because they weren't there themselves. Frankly, they were ready to get out of town. And they thought that we could get ourselves out, we can get the military out, and we'll just trust the Taliban to finish the job. That was the plan?
It was to work with the government of Afghanistan, with the troops of the Afghan government that we had trained and equipped to deal with the withdrawal period, and then for a period after the withdrawal. The plan was to maintain some forces after the withdrawal was completed at Kabul airport and to protect the embassy.
Yeah.
And I believe that assumption, and I keep repeating that because several of your colleagues are mentioning lessons learned, is that we don't plan, as one lesson that I have learned from the outside, is for a single scenario. We have to plan for alternative scenarios and how we would adjust from one to the other.
Well, regardless of how many alternatives we had, that seemed like a particularly bad plan.
Right.
And now with the benefit of hindsight, I think everyone can agree that it was, in fact, a bad plan. In
retrospect, it was problematic, but I explained to you what the assumption was.
I understand. And but in 2004, you wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post titled, quote, Afghanistan's Milestone, which I would like to submit for the record, Mr. Chairman. This op-ed covered the country's approval of a new constitution.
Right.
However, I want to read aloud some sentences that you wrote. Quote, Afghanistan has sent a compelling message to the rest of the world that by investing in that country's development, the United States is investing in success. Americans can take pride in the role that we played in leading the multilateral effort to support Afghan democratization. President Bush's decision to increase aid to Afghanistan, which will likely total more than $2 billion in fiscal 2004, will accelerate reconstruction of the country's national army, police force, economic infrastructure, schools, and medical system. You finished this op-ed by writing, quote, our work in Afghanistan is not yet done. It will take several years and sustained commitment of significant resources by the United States and the international community before the country can stand on its own feet. Given the stakes involved, we must remain committed for as long as it takes, I've heard that phrase before, to succeed. Do you think we were successful?
And without objection, it's entered into the record.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. What can we learn about nation building? It seems pretty foolish to me. I'll admit it seemed foolish at the time.
Well, I have to say I supported President Bush's vision for transforming not only Afghanistan but the broader Middle East. His vision was that problems of that region was
The goals are always nice. And if
Right.
we judge things by what people say they aspire to, it always
was an
sounds so good.
aspirational. That was
But the execution's
aspirational.
problematic. And I will say that, frankly, that same phrase, as long as it takes, as much as it takes,
Yes.
is the only public plan the Biden administration has laid out for Ukraine. And other than that,
Right.
I don't see any tie to Ukraine here. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Wild is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ambassador, thank you so much for your testimony here today. Before I begin my question, I just want us all to take a moment to remember the 13 U.S. service members who lost their lives on August 26th of 2021 while conducting the evacuation. I know that every member of this committee joins me in paying tribute to their families, as well as to the families of all service members who put their lives on the line over the course of our country's longest war. We will continue to honor them, and we will never forget their sacrifices. On August 26th of 2021, I spent much of the day on the phone with a constituent, a mother whose son had very abruptly been sent to Afghanistan to assist in the evacuation. He was stationed at the airport, and she didn't hear from him the entire day. And you can imagine the stress and anxiety that she had as we got the news that service members had been lost. So I will never forget that. And, you know, it's our obligation when we send men and women in uniform into harm's way that we continually ensure that they have the support that they need and that the mission they're being asked to conduct is in our national interest and is achievable. And that their partners on the ground are willing to make the same kind of sacrifices that our troops are making every day. So my question, I think, is simple, but it's probably a complicated answer. It deals with the fundamental underlying reality here. Why, over the course of 20 years in Afghanistan, did administrations of both parties fail to correctly assess the level of dedication and cohesion of the Afghan forces and its political leadership?
Well, that's obviously an excellent question. There are lessons to be learned that we have to focus sharply on that. We spent a lot of resources, a lot of effort. The forces were of varying qualities. They sacrificed a lot, some 70,000 perhaps, 60 to 70,000 Afghan soldiers and policemen died during the period we were there. But what happened to them, our assessment was that they would do a lot better after our withdrawal.
Understood, but my real question is, how did we fail so badly at that over the 20 years? I mean, we know that there was a division in the intelligence community with the CIA on one side and the Pentagon on the other side on the effectiveness of training the Afghan forces.
Right.
And I'm not asking you to go into classified information in a public setting, but can you speak broadly to these divergent perspectives and what interests they may have been driven by?
One is perhaps the way we built the armed forces needs to be questioned. Many people would argue that the Afghans, teaching them how to fight shouldn't have been a difficult task. And the way we organized them perhaps to fight, their recruitment, sustainment, organization, maybe were not appropriate for the circumstances. Perhaps that would be one. Second would be to what extent politics and the divisions in the country affected the force. I was very concerned. I spent a lot of time in 2020 because two candidates announced themselves as presidents, two presidents, and here was a possible scenario in which some forces were going to go with one candidate, the forces we invested so much in, and some would have gone with the other. And you would have had, already you have the war with the Talibs, and then you would have another war inside the Republic side. So there are lessons to be learned.
Well, I'm just going to stop you there because I only have another 30
Sure.
seconds. But I have a very deep concern that from Vietnam to Afghanistan to Iraq, and who knows in the current situation in the world, we keep seeing politicization of intelligence to sort of fit a pre-designed agenda, what seems to be a cherry picking of intelligence and data that administrations may use to tell the story that they want to tell, not necessarily the reality. And that's what I want to see us get away from. With that, I thank you very much. I'm sorry we don't have more time, and I yield back.
Only yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Kim.
Thank you, Chairman, for holding today's hearing, and I want to thank you, Ambassador, for making yourself available and coming before our committee today. Since the disastrous withdrawal from Afghanistan under Biden administration, all heartfelt progress on basic freedoms and rights for Afghan women have vanished. Women made incredible gains in the classroom, played an active role in the Afghan government and free press, and participated in the workforce side by side with their male co-workers. When the Taliban seized power, one of their first actions was to ban girls from attending secondary school. They eliminated the Afghan Commission to eliminate violence against women, banned women from working at NGOs, and started restricting women's access to public areas. Decades of work on women and girls went down the drain in a matter of weeks. As a woman, this is deeply personal to me. It has been raised several times today that you presented the administration with several power-sharing proposals that would give the Taliban partial or majority control of the Afghan government. So what did these peace plans say about women's rights and participation in the Afghan government?
We did give one plan to accelerate the negotiations, since we wanted to see the optimal outcome, or the better option would have been an agreement before withdrawal was completed. And in those draft proposals, Afghanistan's adherence to international standards on human rights, respect for the rights of all Afghan citizens, men, women, minorities, children, were all specified. But in the draft that we shared with them to assist with accelerating the negotiations.
Ambassador, did you think that the Taliban would be willing to share power of the Afghan government with women?
Well, we had them say to us, and they say that publicly and on videos, that women could be ministers, women could be active in all parts of life. What has happened since has been a violation of those statements that are on the record, not to me alone, but to the whole world, that they said that. So
their words and actions didn't match.
Right.
You know, the Taliban was often cited as stating to the United States, you might have the watches, but we have the time.
Right.
Was the Taliban waiting the United States government out so it could overthrow the Afghan government after our departure?
Well, I'd be speculating, but certainly they waited us out in the sense that based on what happened, based on changes in the world, based on successes that we had on counterterrorism, as I've described, we decided that it's time to come home. And there are things we could have done differently in retrospect. Those studies will be done that would have perhaps had a different outcome in terms of the Taliban. One issue as ambassador.
Ambassador, did you consider that as a possibility if power sharing agreement was implemented?
I did certainly consider it as a possibility, because both sides were saying they want that. And the question was the terms. The president of Afghanistan, President Ghani, did not want to leave office. He wanted the Talibs to join them. They said no, they won't join. There has to be a new government that be formed with a head that's acceptable to both sides. So the negotiations were difficult. We knew it was going to take time. The war had been going on there for 40
the President
years.
Biden's unconditional withdrawal legitimized the Taliban's plan of action?
No, our withdrawal, of course, changed the balance in favor of the Taliban. But I believe that the bigger mistake or the bigger factor that shaped the outcome was the poor performance of the government, of the Afghan government, running away while saying that they will never do that. The disintegration of the armed forces, those were the bigger factors, in my judgment, in terms of what ultimately happened.
Well, there is no doubt we saw.
Generally yields. Chair recognizes Ms. Manning.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witness for being here with us today. Mr. Ambassador, I have to be honest with you. Like many Americans, I was shocked when I read the February 2020 Trump-Doha agreement by how few conditions there were for the Taliban to meet. There were no protections for women and girls in Afghanistan or for the Afghan people who had helped us and worked side by side with our forces. Basically, the former president agreed to a precipitous withdrawal of all troops, all coalition partners, and all civilian personnel by May 1st to release 5,000 prisoners, to work with the UN to lift sanctions against the Taliban, to seek economic cooperation for the reconstruction of Afghanistan, and to refrain from the threat or use of force against Afghanistan or intervene in its domestic affairs. In exchange, the Taliban agreed to release up to 1,000 prisoners. For our 5,000, they agreed to release 1,000. They vaguely committed to enter intra-Afghan negotiations and agreed not to allow its members to attack our personnel on the way out. I did not see any agreement to stop attacks against Afghans. I did not see any agreement to prevent them from taking Afghan territory. And I certainly did not see any protection of Afghan women and girls. I did not see any guarantees that Afghanistan would prosecute anyone who commits atrocities against women or girls. I did not see any requirement that the Taliban take steps to keep women and girls in schools. I did not see any requirement that the Taliban take steps to uphold any rights of the Afghan people. Apparently, the protection of women and girls was not important to President Trump. Given the terrible reality that we see today in Afghanistan, including for Afghan women and girls, in retrospect, what should have been done differently to secure protections for vulnerable minority populations, and in particular, women and girls in Afghanistan?
Well, the key issue for you and for our other leaders is whether achieving the goals that you outline on women should have been a precondition for withdrawal, which means that the U.S. forces would have given the responsibility to achieve those rights, that we should have stayed in Afghanistan until the Taliban agreed to those.
To protect women and girls.
Right.
And was that,
And
were you ever instructed on behalf of President Trump to secure those agreements?
And the judgment was that to pursue those objectives with other means other the use of armed forces, because there are lots of violations of human rights around the world, And it's not the responsibility of the U.S. forces
Of human
to go
rights. We're talking
to war.
about half the population of the country.
Right.
Was it ever articulated that one of the goals of withdrawal was to make sure that Afghan women and girls were
Right.
going to be protected? Was that ever articulated as a
That
goal of the Trump administration?
It was articulated that would be pursued in the inter-Afghan negotiations, during which, and we have a written agreement with the, in which it states that we would work with the government, which supported human rights, the legitimate government of Afghanistan, to pursue those objectives in the inter-Afghan negotiations using diplomacy, using the future relations.
So you weren't going to negotiate that with the Taliban. You were going to help behind the scenes the Afghan government that collapsed. You were going to encourage them to work to support women
Which
and girls.
the assumption was, it turned out to be wrong, ma'am, that the government would not collapse, that it had more forces, numbers, more weapons, more international standing, more money. Did you ever believe that the Taliban was truly interested in negotiating with the Afghan government? I saw them negotiate with the Afghan government because negotiations started in September.
But was that before you gave up all the leverage by signing the agreement and frankly, by Donald Trump tweeting in advance what he was going to do in withdrawing our troops?
As I said before, I mean, and there was disagreement, obviously, inside the administration and outside, whether the way the president decided to go was the right way. But the decision was made in our system, as you know. The president makes the decision, others express their opinions, the advisors. The decision was made not to link withdrawal on these other
on the
matters.
protection of Afghan people and Afghan women and girls. My time has expired. I yield.